In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Here we are, Lord, at our second to last study of the history of the church. Be with us tonight and open our hearts up to both the pain and the joy of 1650 to 1900. We love you, Lord. Holy Spirit, be with us all. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. We are off and running. As always, I have more information than you probably want to hear, but we're going to do it anyway. So, history of the church, always, we start with our review. So, 33, Christ's resurrection, Jewish persecutions. 64, Nero starts the sporadic Christian persecutions. 70, Rome raises the temple in Jerusalem. 100, the last apostle, John, dies, the deposit of faith closes, and public revelation ends. 100 to 300, written faith descriptions by people as they head to their martyrdom, and the blood of the martyrs seeds the church. 300 to 400, Christianity legalized. We have the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, pegging the Trinity, and in Rome, the canon of the Bible is written down for the first time in the same form that we have it today. 400 to 500, the great Saint Augustine. Ephesus and Chalcedon are the two councils that will peg down how the divine and human natures of Jesus combine in one divine person. The West falls, first Rome, then the whole empire. And we have a great pope, Leo. Then we get Gregory the Great from 500 to 600 in the 500 to 600 century, and monasticism spreads the faith. From 600 to 800, we have Islam in the Eastern Christian Empire that's rising. We have Charles Martel in the Western, who stops the advance of Islam. We have another council, Nicaea II, that says that veneration of saints and images is a go, it's allowed. Then we have Charlemagne, who becomes the emperor again in the Western Empire, ends the Dark Ages. In the East and Western churches, the Greek speakers and the Latin speakers are diverging. From 800 to 1000, we have Charlemagne's Renaissance, and it turns into feudalism. We have the Papal Iron Age, which is ended by German emperors, and Cluny, the great monastery, rises. From 1000 to 1250, we have the Eastern Schism, where Latin and Greek-speaking churches excommunicate each other. Christendom, which includes the Crusades, lots of religious orders rising, St. Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism, the great universities start, and the Inquisition. 1250 to 1450, Christendom ends. The popes go to Avignon, France. We have famine and the Black Death in Europe. We have Wycliffe, John Wycliffe in England. We get the Western Schism, where we've got 3 popes reigning at once. Conciliarism ends that. They elect a pope, though, and he ends conciliarism. And then we have a priest, Huss, who was German, and he ends up being burned at the stake at an ecumenical council. 1450 to 1650, now we have the Renaissance that is the normal one that we talk about with Renaissance art. We have Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain. We've got Martin Luther, who breaks from the Catholic faith and starts his own, followed by Calvin. Henry VIII just schisms. He makes himself the Pope of England. And he ends up killing Saints Thomas More and Cardinal John Fisher because they won't admit that he's the Pope. We have the rise of the Jesuits, who are the Pope's right-hand men. They take a fourth vow. We've got Trent, the council that forms in order to answer all the problems caused by the Protestant Reformation. We have the battle at Lepanto, where Islam is stopped from invading Europe. In France, we have Catherine de Medici, and Catherine is the one who is acting as regent and tries to moderate between Protestants and Catholics, but ends up getting very mad at the Huguenots, the Calvinists, and many of them are massacred on St. Bartholomew's Day. Then we have the 30-year war, where we've got about how many million did we say died? I think it was 12, 13 million, something like that. Lots and lots of people die in the 30-year war as Lutheran fights Calvinists, fight Catholics. And when it all ends, we get another heresy in the Catholic Church called Jansenism. And finally, we talked about Galileo Galilei and his trial. So that was the 1450s to the 1650s. So now we're going to start in the 1650s and start by talking about enlightened despotism, which we kind of talked about last time, absolute despotism. And it comes about Louis the 16th, or excuse me, Louis the 14th, the Sun King, rescinds the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed toleration of the Huguenots. Remember, the Huguenots were Calvinists. And after the 30-year war, they were extended toleration, but Louis decides he wants the nation to be Catholic. But he views the church as a facility for which the state is responsible, and he distrusts Rome. And so anytime the church and the state butt heads, he intervenes. And so it's really the Catholics being ruled, like in England, by their emperor. The French bishops actually back Louis instead of the Pope, and Bishop Bossuet, who is in France, composes the Organic Articles that define something we call Gallicanism. Remember, Gaul was the name that France had, and you can see why the church would call it Gallicanism. It says popes must respect the customs of particular churches. So if the custom of the church in France is that the emperor picks the bishops, well, then the Pope has to respect that. Popes are subject to ecumenical councils, right? It's a return to conciliarism that was already ended in our last study. And papal decrees of faith are only infallible if they have been accepted by the church, i.e. an ecumenical council. And again, it's saying the council rules over the Pope. Needless to say, the Pope was not particularly thrilled with Gallicanism. Enlightened despotism spreads. The Jesuit, the Pope's right-hand religious order, right? They took the fourth vow, poverty, chastity, obedience, and that they would be the Pope's right-hand man, that they would be his protector and his special teachers. They're expelled from Portugal, Spain, and Naples and declared illegal in France because they represent the Pope, and they're trying to keep the Pope as far distant as they can. So the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, are actually dissolved by Pope Clement the 14th, and he does that because he's trying to keep the peace. There are actually fights starting and Jesuits being killed because they're spreading the faith and telling people that the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. In Germany, we get something called Febroniism, and it makes the Pope's only function administrative. All he really does is like mails out letters to all bishops who are Catholic. He doesn't have any real power. Again, they say the councils are supreme and that the churches are subordinate to the German princes. So just a different flavor. In Austria, it was called Josephinism, because Joseph II, who was the emperor of Austria, was the one who was ruling the church. And they just made it a department inside their government. And it was in charge of worship and the promotion of morality. And the government oversaw all the details like they would anything in their cabinet. In Russia, it was Peter the Great who suppressed the patriarch of the Russian church, right? This would be an Orthodox church that had already schismed, the Great Eastern Schism. And he replaces it with a state-controlled synod. So again, all the emperors, all the rulers of these countries are taking over leadership of the church. As the old regime fades out, right, where emperor and pope actually respected each other and had their own duties, the church hierarchy and absolutist monarchies, it's mostly from the aristocratic level, and they're submissive to the royal powers and very distant from the pope. Now, you did have some people who remained loyal to the Pope who were Catholic. Actually, you had many, and many bishops who did too. In France, they, I think their names were Montaignes, because it was the French word for mountains. These people looked over the mountains and into Italy where they saw the Pope, and they were the rivals of these Gallicans who were submissive to the emperor. The church is given official protection by all these countries and wears the trappings and the traditional privileges, but it's really a sham because, right, Catholicism means that you are under Peter and Peter heads the church, but that was not really the case. The upper classes are becoming irreligious, and we will talk about why when we talk about the Enlightenment. And there's a dearth of great saints right now. There's not a lot of creativity or missionary spirit in the church. And while the popes are quite worthy and very respectable, they're just flat and dull. They aren't great leaders. They don't make anybody rise up, right? Like the great saints. They're just there. They're not bad men, but they're not great leaders. And the Christian people themselves seem tired and anemic. And I get that shouldn't be a surprise, right? They've just gone through France, where many million were killed, then the 30-year war, where many people are killed. They've been facing bubonic plagues and famines, and they're just worn out. So now we're going to talk about the time period called the Enlightenment. And it goes, historically, it goes from about 1685 to 1815. And we'll start before that time period with kind of somebody who kicked it all off, named René Descartes. Now, he introduced what was called Cartesian rationalism. He was a mathematician. And but this was a philosophical thing that he got into. Many mathematicians and physicists do. And he decided to reject everything that's not absolutely clear to human reason. Now, he didn't apply it to religion. He just applied it to math and science. And so he doesn't apply it to religion, but now, starting in the Enlightenment, we have Baruch Spinoza, and most people just call him Spinoza. You may have heard of him before. He uses reason to demolish the biblical age of the world, right? And you still have Baptist churches that will do this. They'll go into the Bible and they'll add up all the ages of all the people that are named in the Old Testament, and they just keep adding and adding until they figure out. I think they figured out that the Earth is I forget 30,000 years old, 3,000 years. I can't remember what the numbers add up to. At any rate, they don't add up to the age of the world. And you know, I had a Baptist friend in Gig Harbor, and she one time explained to me how the dinosaur bones that were found and then scientifically figured out how old they were, that they weren't really that old, that God had just buried those to test people's faith. And she truly believed this, which, I mean, I don't. But that's what Spinoza starts out with. And then he just rejects the whole historical use of the Bible. He's like, this is just a myth. It's all made up. It's all superstition. There are no miracles. There is no supernatural order. So he jettisons all revealed religion. So revealed religion is replaced by natural religion, because a lot of people have that feeling about God, you know, yeah, I can see where maybe somebody did create the earth. Seems like it's pretty rationally ordered. So yeah, I believe in God. But in deism, it pushes him into the background. If you've ever heard God described as a watchmaker who makes a watch and then he steps away from it, he has no personal interest in it. He just made it because he wanted to make a watch. So that's why he created our universe, our solar system, us, is just to see how we would tick down. And I actually claimed to be a deist for a while. First, I said I was an atheist, but I didn't know how to prove there was no God. So then it was really easiest to say, oh, I'm a deist because, you know, there's a God, but he doesn't care. Oh, I was a mess. So deism develops into Freemasonry, which is a secret society that was founded in Britain, and it rejects all religion with a definite historic founder, especially Christianity, right? Because Christ founded it. But you would reject Judaism because Abraham founds it and Moses. And you would reject Buddhism because Buddha founds it. You would reject Islam because Mohammed, right? You would reject essentially all religions except deism, because there's no founder, just a belief in God. And it encourages brotherhood and philanthropy among its members. A good example of it here in the United States would be the Shriners on their little go-karts and their Shriners Hospital, right? They do some very good things. They're philanthropists, but they also are supposed to be deists. Now, I have known Catholic men who have been Shriners. They're not supposed to be, because you have to take an oath that says that you don't believe in any God with a historic founder, but they do it for the camaraderie and because Shriners do good things and they want to be a part of it. But right, that's just a way to undermine religion in another way. Jesus said to do nice things. Well, you don't need Jesus to tell you that. You should do nice things because you're a human being. So anyway, the Sun King dies and the philosophes take over France. And the high priest of the philosophes is Voltaire. That was his pen name. His real name, Francois-Marie Arouet, is too hard to say, so he just always went by his pen name. And one of his famous quotes, Jesus Christ needed 12 apostles to spread the gospel. I'm going to show that one is enough to destroy it. Voltaire was a very, very arrogant philosopher. The core philosophies of the Enlightenment. Dogmatic truth is an expression of intolerance and fanaticism. So when the Catholic Church holds an ecumenical council and they come out with a dogma and they say, in order to be Catholic, you must believe this. They're just intolerant and fanatic. Orthodoxy, which is actually following what a faith believes, is an expression of the intellectual limitations of retarded minds and the enemy of progress. They believe that you should think freely and in the political sphere indiscriminately tolerate all beliefs. So that was the core philosophies that came out of all these great thinkers of the Enlightenment. And we're going to see what it produces. In Catholic France, it produced the encyclopedia. And France was the first one to have an encyclopedia. And it took them many years to write it, as you can see. And in this encyclopedia, they seek to show intellectually that Christianity is incompatible with experimental science and reason, sort of like Spinoza showing that the earth can't possibly be just this many years old. They were just like constantly throwing darts at especially Christianity, because that's what most people in France and Europe were. In Protestant Germany, the Aufklärung outlines reasonable Christianity without dogmas or miracles. So Christ is not really God, he's just a nice guy. Immanuel Kant is able to prove both the absolute unreasonable of God's existence and the absolute certainty of God's existence by looking at it from two ways. And right, Kant is considered this enormous, great mind. When I was in college, I took a class called European Intellectual History. And up until that point, I had straight A's in college. I got a C in European Intellectual History because the way these philosophers thought was so irrational to me. I mean, it was like, are you kidding me? It was very hard for me to take seriously, but you're going to see how they change the world. The majority unenlightened keep their faith, but the enlightened are very influential, right? They're the great thinkers of the time. They're the ones who are teaching at the universities, and they're passing it on to all these aristocrats. And so that's where enlightenment starts. And the Enlightenment will start revolutions, and France is the first to go. In 1789, King Louis XVI opens up the National Assembly, and he just thinks it's going to be another National Assembly. Well, within 3 months, the clergy and the nobility renounced their traditional privileges, and church property is secularized. So everything that the church owns is taken away from it. And what happens is all sorts of people in the assembly and their relatives take all these treasures from the church, and it makes the bourgeoisie, the middle class of France, because now they have all the riches of the church. Then the assembly approves the civil constitution of the clergy. And what that said was that the people themselves would elect the bishops and clergy, and that once they were elected, they had to swear fidelity to the political constitution or be deported. They started out deporting them from France. Then they found out it was easier just to execute them. So if you got elected, you better swear to the political constitution. In 1793, Louis XVI is guillotined. I shouldn't say that. I don't know that he was guillotined. He was executed. And then the 10-month reign of terror begins with Robespierre. And Robespierre, his favorite thing to do was to guillotine people. So 17,000 people in that 10 months are either guillotined or murdered. The number of the guillotined in Paris is right around 1,500. All the rest are just kind of scattered around and killed in many brutal ways. Robespierre has the goddess of reason enthroned in Notre Dame, so that you know that there is no other god in there, just reason. And he starts the cult of the supreme being. So deism, right? It's just this God who is the God of reason. And he gets rid of the calendar, right? Because even though it's not Christian gods that are named on the calendar, it is pagan gods. And so he replaces it with a Republican calendar. And iconoclasm comes back, right? Iconoclasm is when you destroy all religious artwork, sculptures, churches, and Europe still bears the scars of this time in history. The persecutions ebb and flow through 1799. At the end of 10 months, Robespierre and his cronies are actually captured by others and guillotined. So no, not that the terror really ends, but it at least moderates and ebbs and flows. In 1798, France occupies Rome, and he deports the Pope first to places within Rome, and then finally Pius VI is deported to France, and he dies there. He was elderly when he was deported, and it broke him. So in 1799, Napoleon has been a general for the French army, but there's a coup d'etat, and now he becomes the government of France, and he takes the title First Consul. And by 1804, he continues to be a very successful general. He conquers all these different countries, and he becomes the emperor over them in 1804. Meanwhile, Pope Pius VII is elected in Venice in the year 1800. And Napoleon is no fool. He sees that in France, even though they've tried to use terror to squelch Christianity and all sorts of madness to try to get rid of Jesus in people's life, it's not working. And so he signs a concordant with the Pope, an agreement. But as soon as he walks away from the signing of it, he amends it. And he amends it with all the things that were already in the Gallican belief system, so that he again becomes the one who controls the church. So Christianity returns to France, but it's Gallican Christianity, Catholicism. And but the Pope is glad that at least Christ is back in their life, and he kind of, you know, I wouldn't say gets along with Napoleon, but exists under Napoleon. Inside France, even though Christianity is now allowed to exist again, there's still a large core of people who don't want to be Christians, right? The people who stole all the stuff from the church, they don't want to give it back, and they don't want the church to ever have it again. Professional soldiers, the aristocracy for the most part, and a lot of the kind of middle class working people saw no need for it, right? They were enlightened minds. They didn't need religion, and they didn't want to see it come back. In 1809, Napoleon imprisons and then deports Pius VII and annexes the Papal States because the Pope would not agree to blockade England with him, and it made him mad. So he annexes all the Papal States. Again, first he exiles him to someplace in Italy, and then he ends up exiling him all the way to France. But he doesn't kill him, and so from France in 1814, Pius VII restores the Jesuit order, so that we've got Jesuits going out on mission again. The Pope is set free on the 7th of June, 1815, and Napoleon meets his Waterloo on the 18th of June. So he is defeated by the rest of Europe. After Napoleon's defeat, Europe tries to restore the alliance of throne and altar, what had made Christendom so powerful and so creative and so wonderful. But the stage was set for political revolution by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So it just failed. They could not restore it. So enlightened thought morphs into a philosophy called liberalism. And liberalism said, it had some key tenets to it. It said, man is free, all men are equal, and they are not bound by God's law. That man, every man, has inalienable rights of freedom, and those freedoms are of conscience, of thought, of association, and of press. They said that power comes from the people, not from God, and that the only source of legitimate government is when the people determine what the government's going to be and who it's going to be. They said religion is a private matter. There is no true religion. And if you do in your religion decide to build a church, the church is just another association, like, you know, the Lions Club or the Elks Club. And it's on the fringe of public life. It's not really important. And it is subject to the state's laws. So that's what liberalism believed. And in France, there were liberal Catholics, including priests, who were trying to harmonize this philosophy with Catholicism. And their big motto was God and liberty. But once Pope Gregory the 16th saw what they were publishing and what they had agreed to, he's like, no, you know, you can't be deists and be Catholic. And he just kind of nixed that. And actually the priest who was really heading it out in France quit the Catholic Church. But a bunch of the other people who were involved actually became stronger Catholics because what the Pope told them. So that was good. There was something called liberal nationalism, right? People looked around. Now they had this thought, you know, that we're all equal. We're not bound by God's law. But look at all of us who live in this area. We all speak Italian. And we're broken into all these different little places. We should unite. And all of us who speak Italian should have this one great enlightened country. And so all these different nations start this liberal nationalism, and they get religion out of stuff, right? There's no true religion. And they're trying to get everybody equal and everybody free. And countries who took it up, who had leaders who were not Catholic, it actually emancipated the Catholics in their country, which included Poland, Belgium, Ireland, Britain. Now the Catholics there can actually practice their faith, which they couldn't before. So it had its up points. So we're going to talk about Pope Pius IX. He had a very long reign as Pope from 1846 to 1878. So over 30 years. And he was a very nice man. And he was kind of, when he was elected Pope, everybody's like, oh my gosh, we've elected a liberal as the Pope. And they were actually kind of horrified that he had been elected. And he was kind of in that strain, but it wasn't long after his papacy started that he had to flee Rome, chased by Italians, because he refused to declare a holy war on Austria. Austria had the northern part of the Italian peninsula, and it was part of their country. And they wanted a holy war to take that back. And so he's chased out of Rome, and the only way he gets to return is because French soldiers come to his aid. They surround him and take him back into Rome and protect him. And that kind of turned him against nationalistic liberalism. If he was a liberal before that started, he certainly was not afterwards. He ends up losing the papal states, all these states that surround Rome. And it's a gradual process, but they're all being taken over by the King of Italy and by other Italians, right? The Sons of Italy, who want a united Italy, slowly but surely take away all the papal states. And he becomes a voluntary prisoner in the Vatican. All that's left is this tiny little area where the Vatican exists. And he fought hard for the papal states because they had existed for 1,000 years. And what they did was they made a perimeter around the Pope that allowed him not to be so influenced by other countries as he tried to lead the Catholic Church. He writes an encyclical condemning 80 modern errors of the Enlightenment, including the autonomy of reason, that reason alone answers all questions. He condemned deism, materialism, attacks on the family, defense of divorce, which the Enlightenment did, right? If you don't get along with your spouse, certainly you should get divorced. He had 80 of these things that he wrote about and condemned. His pontificate, unlike the dull, flat popes that came before him, it was one of great vitality in the church. Religious orders are reformed and invigorated, including the Jesuits, the Dominicans, who else am I thinking of? Another big religious order. Can't think of them right now, but the old religious orders are really invigorated, and new, it's the Benedictines. That's who I was trying to think of. And new ones formed. And probably the best known of them is the Salesians, which was formed by Don Bosco. So Saint Don Bosco, I should say. The clergy improve. There are lots more of them, and they act a lot more like priests, right? And they put back on their clerics. They had been afraid to wear them because if you were in your collar and your clerical outfit, you were oftentimes killed, right? Because Europe was so anti-clerical. So clergy improves, the laity forms new apostolic and social welfare initiatives. Probably the best known, the St. Vincent de Paul, that all the helping of the poor started at this time by the laity. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception is defined by him in 1854. He speaks from the chair of Peter. The First Vatican Council is held in 1869 to 70, and it produces the dogma of papal infallibility. You can see why the council really concentrated on that, because all these emperors are trying to make themselves the popes of their own nationalistic churches, and just say, well, the pope's not infallible unless a council agrees with him. Vatican I says that's not so. In this limited area of faith and morals, the Pope is infallible, and he doesn't need everybody else in the council to agree with him. And he spoke from the chair of Peter for that dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And then they also came out with a teaching on the relationship between faith and reason. They were going to address big social problems of the time, but they didn't have time because it was in 1870 that the Papal States fell. And now everybody who was at Vatican I was in danger of being killed by the mobs that were closing in on the Vatican. And so they all went home. So They only had a limited number of things they were able to deal with, and those were the two biggest ones. By now, communication, i.e. the telegraph, is now in use. And so people are able to communicate, and they're able to be transported on steamships, on railroads, and so they can make their way to Rome. And that makes the Pope accessible. And Pius IX is the first loved Pope of modern history. By now you got the printing press, you've got cameras. Everybody in their house had a picture of Pius IX over their fireplace, right? He was a very, very loved Pope. Well, the Enlightenment, right? It was deistic. It wasn't anti-religious, because you said, well, we do believe in a God. He just is this amorphous God. He's one who doesn't care about us or anything, but we think there is one. But there were some anti-religious philosophies too. One of them was called positivism, and it said that all reasonable claims can be scientifically verified or logically or mathematically proven, i.e. you don't need philosophy or religion. They're irrelevant. You just need science. That can fix everything. That can answer all your questions. And positivism grew into materialism. Here, all facts, including facts about the human mind, our will, the course of human history, are dependent upon or reducible to physical processes. And just kind of an example out of our time period, I just read about, right, when the church has always taught that when you die, right, you have to go before God and answer for your life. And that all these things that you did will be brought before you, both good and bad. And well, I just saw a thing where there was a guy who died while he was having his brain monitored, and they didn't expect him to die. He just like had a massive heart attack or something, and he dies while they're doing this. And they see the portion of the brain that is responsible for memory just draining itself. So all of a sudden, this man would have seen his life pass before him. I've seen the scientific explanations for why it is that a lot of people, when they're dying, see a bright light. And well, right, everything could be explained by some physical process. Well, materialism turns into Marxism. Marx reads about it, and Marx develops this theory that conflicts are caused by material needs, and they shape political and historical events. These conflicts do. And he's got this theory about class struggle, that some people own the modes of production, the bourgeoisie, and other people have to work in these modes of production, the workers, the proletariat, and that there is a constant class struggle between these two. These guys are trying to make a bigger profit and hold on to everything, and these guys are trying to struggle for their life and get some type of equality. And so he also had a labor theory of value, that the value of anything is how much labor that's put into it. And one of his famous quotes is that religion is the opium of the people, right? Most people are not the ones who own the mode of production. They are the ones who are laborers. And when you give them Christianity, now you teach them it's okay to suffer, that God, maybe that's what he desires of your life, right? And it's always a big conflict in people's lives, like, how can God let my child suffer or let me suffer like this? Well, Marx just said, well, it's because it's a myth, it's a superstition. It was just a way for rich people to get you to work for them and not revolt. And so that was a very anti-religious philosophy. So it gets put to work in the Industrial Revolution, which is generally given years 1760 to 1680, or excuse 1760 to 1840. And we're also going to talk about Leo the 13th right now. So the Industrial Revolution creates this new working class concentrated in large cities. Right, on the farms, farming is being industrialized. So you don't need all these people, all these children that you used to have in order to get the fields plowed and crops weeded and taken back in. You don't need them anyway. Send them to the city. Inside the city, you used to have all these artisans who made coats and hats and all sorts of beautiful woodwork. Criminy, you got factories that'll put those out now. So all these people are displaced and they're kind of lost in these large cities, and they're in the outskirts of it. And they work really long hours at low wages in horrendous working conditions, with child labor being very common and very bad living conditions. So it's almost as though they're slaves, right? Anybody who's watched The Christmas Carol or read many of Charles Dickens's books, he has a great way of describing what the Industrial Revolution was like in Britain. You have trade unions that start forming in these industries, and the anarchists and Marxists bring in their own doctrines, right? Anarchists believe that there should be no state at all. Just get rid of the state, get rid of all religion, and the workers themselves will rule the world, right? Of course, it's chaos because you got to have leadership. But they don't believe that it is. There are still anarchists around. And the Marxists, right, believed in this class struggle, and that the middle bourgeoisie would first help the proletariat to revolt, and then ultimately the proletariat would rule their own country, and they would rule all the forms of production. And communism is a form of Marxism, and we've seen how poorly it works. It never works well. As you can tell from all the Russian oligarchs who have billions and billions of dollars, right? But they go into these trade unions with their philosophies, and they breed hostility towards the church and Christianity, right? They're told, geez, the church is just part of this whole capitalist thing that is holding you down. They tell you it's about suffering and Jesus and all this stuff about the cross. And so now the workers start losing their faith. Well, Pope Leo the 13th starts tackling the social issue. He gathers all this data and all these documents that had been gathered for Vatican I. And he actually tells one of his cardinals, he instructs him, oppose socialist associations with popular Christian ones. Leave the sacristies, go out to the people. And right, it's sort of like St. Francis says, a pastor should smell like his sheep. And that's what Leo was saying, go out to the people and help them, right? And he, in 1891, he publishes an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, of new things. And in it, he rejects Marxism. And instead, he asks the owners of industries and the workers to cooperate and to develop a new society of just wages and property ownership, with the state helping, right? By this time, the state, it really just feels like all it has to do is stand back, and the wheels of industry will keep things rolling, and they should try to be as non-involved as possible. Leo says, no, you need to be involved. You need to make sure that it is fair, and that that it is given a fair shake to everybody. He encourages Catholics to become involved in political life. And he restores Thomistic philosophy, this scholasticism that we talked about with St. Thomas Aquinas. And that affects a renewal of Christian thought. People start trying to use reason to mesh with faith so that they understand God better. And in knowing God better, they love him more. And loving him more, they go out and help all of mankind more. He was a peacemaker. Countries called him in to help solve problems in their country, and he smooths rough waters in Germany and France and Spain, and he gains the respect of the whole world. So another one of our truly remarkable popes. In the colonies, right, the United States, because first they're not the United States, they are just the colonies. At the gathering place last week, they said, what's happening in America? So I'm going to tell you what's happening in America in this time frame. In 1634, Lord Baltimore hosts the first Catholic settlement in the colonies, right? St. Augustine is in Florida, is actually the first place that there is a Catholic parish built. However, it wasn't part of the initial 13 colonies, so I didn't include it here. But he hosts the first Catholic settlement. And it's kind of interesting. The Catholics come over. Number one, they somehow, some way are not forced to take the oath that most people coming to the New World have to take. And it's included, there's two priests on these two boats called the Dove and the Ark are the names of the ships. And they sail, the Catholics don't take the oath that says that they don't have an oath to another clerical power, i.e. the Pope. And they sail with a whole bunch of Protestants, and they all go to Maryland. And the Protestants and the Catholics live in peace next to each other as they settle the land. But in 1642, Virginia, which is very Calvinistic, very puritanical, is upset that they have Catholics living next door to them in Maryland. So they outlaw priests, and they pass laws that say Catholics can't vote. In 1649, Maryland's General Assembly passes an act of toleration for all Christians. But the Puritans repeal it in 1654. They finally get enough people in Maryland that they can repeal it and once again outlaw priests and make it so Catholics can't vote. In 1683, New York enacts acts of religious toleration. In 1718, the right to vote is denied Catholics in Maryland. I guess they just outlawed the priests when they repealed the act of toleration. But by 1718, they're not allowed to vote either. And it's kind of interesting, in 1774, right, we're getting ready for 1776 when we revolt from Great Britain and gain our independence. Well, the Continental Congress in 1774 denounces Catholicism to Britain, but it speaks very softly to the French Canadians because they see on the screen that it's time to break and run from Britain, and they know they aren't strong enough to do it on their own. So they don't want the French Canadians, who are Catholic, to not be on their side. In 1776, Virginia, of course, you have the Revolutionary War, and now the states write their own Bill of Rights, and Virginia puts full religious freedom in its Bill of Rights, and then Pennsylvania and Maryland follow suit. However, in 1777, New York bars Catholics from public office. And the way that they do that is they say that there can be no oath to foreign powers or either ecclesiastical, i.e. church, or civil authorities. So you can't take an oath to anybody foreign, and the Pope is foreign, he's part of the church, you can't run for public office. In 1787, though, we see how diverse America is, right? You've got pockets where Catholicism's not tolerated at all. However, two Catholics, Daniel Carroll, who's from Maryland, and Thomas Fitzsimmons, who's from Pennsylvania, signed the Constitution. In 1791, the Bill of Rights is approved as amendments to the Constitution by 3/4 of the states passing them. And that includes the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of religion. In 1814, you have the first Catholic orphanage built, right? This is one of the things that the popes were trying to say: Christians, help the poor. And so this first Catholic orphanage was actually in Philadelphia. And you've got women religious forming up that are our very own groups that come from the United States that are formed here. In 1828, you get the first Catholic hospital west of the Mississippi, and that happened to be in St. Louis. In 1830, you would think, oh, great, the Catholics are getting along with the Protestants now. No, not true. In 1830, the Protestant ministers launch an anti-Catholic newspaper. And the reason they do it is because we are a country of immigrants, and lots of the immigrants that were coming here were Catholic, right? They were coming from Germany, they were coming from Poland, they were coming from Ireland. And the Protestant ministers are like, oh my gosh, this country's becoming Catholic. And so they started something called the Nativist movement. And it's kind of funny because they also started a political party called the Native American Party. It was not made up of American Indians. It was made up of Protestants. And they were also called the Know Nothing political party. I have to look up why they got the name Know Nothing, but the Know Nothings, I had heard of them before. I never really realized that they were a group who hated Catholics. In 1834, the Ursuline Convent in Massachusetts is burned by a nativist mob. In 1844, 10 years later, Philadelphia rioters are provoked by nativists, and they burn 2 Catholic churches and kill 13 people. So the religious wars, though they didn't spread like they did and exist like they did in Europe, they have come to America. But again, we're looking at pockets of it in America. Meanwhile, diplomatic relations are established between the US and the Papal States. Now, right shortly, there will be no Papal States by, I think it was 1870, because Leo XIII will lose them. And when that happens, of course, diplomatic relationships go away. And now you just have the Vatican and the small amount of land that comprises Vatican City. And we won't have diplomatic relationships with them until, I want to say it was George Bush. It was either Ronald Reagan. I think it was Ronald Reagan who established diplomatic relationships again with the Vatican. But in 1848, we did with the Papal States. In 1861, Lincoln sends Archbishop Hughes to France to ask them to remain neutral in the Civil War, right? Send a Catholic to the Catholic nation. In 1875, you have the Congregation for Propagation of the Faith that is in Rome, instructing the Catholic bishops here in the United States to build parochial schools, because children going to public schools will have their faith endangered. And so in 1889, you get the opening of Catholic University of America there in Washington, D.C. In 1891, Saint Mother Catherine, well, I should say Mother Catherine Drexel, but she is a saint now. She was the second saint who was actually canonized, who was born in the United States. And she founds the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and they work among the Blacks and the Indians, right? Those were the super poor of the United States, were the Blacks and the Indians. And Catherine Drexel was a woman from a lot of money, and she gave it all up, and it became this amazing. If you're going to read about a great saint, we're to study great saints next year. So we'll talk about Catherine Drexel, amazing woman. 1899, Pope Leo XIII writes an apostolic letter to the bishops of America on the errors of Catholic Americanism. The problem was that Catholics in America wanted special rules. They didn't want the same old Catholicism that Europe had, because we felt that we were special because we were living amongst all these Protestants, and so we were asking for leniency and all sorts of things. And the Pope writes, and he's like, it's called a universal church because all across the world we live by the same rules, and I am not changing them for you. So that happens in 1899, which gets us ready for next week, which is our last session before summer break, and we will study the church from 1900 to 2023. And so we will stop sharing and thank God for the history of his church, for sending his son into this world. We thank you, Lord. We praise you, and thank you for this evening with my friends and studying your church. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. And we'll stop recording.